First up is a good thumb, because a good thumb is probably the most important thing when getting people to engage with your content. Don't have a blank screen, don't put the blue puppet in the foreground, don't use any special effects, camera effects in your thumb. It will immediately put people off looking. Trust me on this one. You might think it looks cool, but it's going to make people scroll straight past your creation. Your thumb has got to be vibrant, it's got to be clear, crisp, it's got to be oversaturated and sharpened, even if the finished item within isn't the same. You've got to grab their attention. If it's a forest with a path, take the viewer on a journey. Make them wonder what's down that path. If it's a cave, the same thing. If it's a house, the same thing. If you've got a protagonist, have the protagonist looking into the game, into the adventure. It'll put player in mind of the journey ahead, or the potential journey ahead. Drag them in. It's your opening paragraph, if you want to look at it that way. It's probably the most important thing. So make sure you get it right and grab their attention. If you haven't got a finished item, never ever put an intro on it to your name, branding, and then an intro to the game. There's nothing worse than sitting through a lengthy intro of your name and branding and then sitting through a lengthy intro to the game itself, only to find that the game is about 5 to 10 minutes long. Don't ever publish the intro as a separate thing. You might be excited with your intro because you've done it really well, but people will remember. They will see it and they will remember. And next time they scroll past, they will assume, or may assume, that all they're looking at is the same thing they looked at before. It's because of the search functionality partly, but that's the way it is. There is so much content, people try to cut the potential down a bit so that it makes it less threatening. So don't go over the top with an intro to your name and branding or the story itself. If it's incomplete but you've got a decent amount of gameplay in there, just cut straight into the gameplay. Don't tease something great and offer something measly. It will be a detrimental thing to do to your branding and your game when it's finished. Now you've got people with the thumb, you've sent them straight to the gameplay. So that gameplay has to be engaging and interesting. And it's got to be a decent chunk of gameplay, so that the player leaves feeling satisfied, enthralled, engaged, and above all else expecting of the next update, which should never come immediately. I'll get onto that in a minute. But make sure you've got some gameplay. If you haven't got the gameplay, simply put it out as a scene for people to stroll around. And if you haven't got a protagonist yet, don't use the blue mannequin. For heaven's sake, don't use that. Take a character from the Dreamverse. There's plenty out there, and a good character can lift your level. Even if it's not the character you will be using in the end, at least you will get people engaged with the environment, looking around it, admiring it, examining it, and maybe spreading the word. It would certainly appear on my channel if it looked good, even if it was just an environment. So yeah, make sure all these three things are in place Make sure you don't oversell yourself. Give it a good thumb, and make sure that when they get inside your game, there's at least a chunk of gameplay or a decent environment to stroll around. Save your updates locally. Don't think it's going to help your cause by putting out small updates regularly because you think it's going to get you in the trending or the news section. It won't work. It's counterproductive. Eventually you'll get a reputation for seeking hits. If you just change a tree bark, an update. If you just change a sound, an update. If you do something that can't even be seen, an update. Eventually people will get fed up and move on. Save all your updates locally. And when you do update, make sure it's noticeable. So when the player returns, they immediately see it and get excited for your next update. It's best to hold off. Once you've teased, once you've given them something of a taster, hold off until you're close to completion of at least that first level, that first section, and then update. Like I said, don't keep updating constantly. I know from my own experience that I have many creators now that I just flick straight past because they're doing it constantly. I've noticed that people are doing it now, just ahead of the release of the full game. You are really being detrimental to your brand. It's not a good idea. It really isn't. I know it's tempting, but don't do it. Release something without the cutscenes, straight into the gameplay, that's a nice chunk of experience for people to enjoy, and then while you're doing the updates, leave that as it is. You might slide down the queue a bit, but once you've got a sizable update and you release it, interest will grow again in your creation. So you've grabbed people with your thumb, you've sent them straight to the gameplay because you haven't got a branding cutscene and you haven't got a game cutscene, and they're playing your game. It's a good chunk of well-honed gameplay because you've been saving your updates locally. They're surprised, they're excited, they can see the difference between the first time they played and the last time they played. Now you have a reputation. Now you're not wasting their time with an intro and you're straight into the gameplay. What comes next is probably more important than most things, and that is the way you end your first part of the game. Never just make them approach a gate at the door and say next part coming soon. Don't do that. Make a bit of an effort. End on a cliffhanger. If you can have a sweeping camera moving to the next level or part of the next level or a hint of the next level and have to be continued, drag them in like that. Don't leave them hanging. Don't finish the first part. Move them to almost the finish of the first part on a cliffhanger. End in a cliffhanger so that they're excited to see what comes next. That will make them look forward to your next update, which will be part 2. But make sure that part 2 is finished. Don't do the same with part 2 as I've suggested you do with part 1. Make sure when you do publish part 2, it's going to be as well honed as part 1. Hopefully you've listened to what I've said in the previous sections. this is something that is important too. Don't ever use your final title. Use a placeholder title. Write yourself about 3 or 4 different titles down and rate them from 1 to how many ever, 10th, 1st, and use your second best title. This is very important, as it is with the thumb too. Do not use the same thumb for the final build. Do not use the same title for the final build, because what you're doing now is you're releasing the complete game. You've changed your thumb to a new thumb. You've given it its proper title. You've added in your branding. You've added in your intro and your cutscenes. And now you're publishing. People will be excited because they've seen you've followed everything I've said prior to this. You've not been wasting their time with silly updates. You've been straight into the gameplay, and it's been a decent chunk of gameplay. Now you've got the finished item. They're going to be more excited than ever to play the complete thing. So that is it. Those are simple rules to follow, most of which I know from running a YouTube channel, playing games myself, and to be honest, just going past content constantly because it doesn't look engaging, or cutting out of content because the cutscene and the intros are far too long. People haven't got an infinite amount of time, but they will have an infinite amount of time for a completed and tight experience. Earn that reputation, and people will continuously return to your creations because they know you stand for quality and no messing. Well, all that's left for me to say is fare thee well, toodle pip, au revoir, and all that good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this, folks. I'll see you on another one. Bye.